I met about an hour ago to check that you could hear song, and um, I'll perhaps, Nancy, I'll sort of wave or something when it should be singing, and perhaps you could just confirm if it's okay. I think we're okay because I put the audio settings on the right thing, um, but just to be sure that that's going to work. So what I want to talk about, the roots of ethno-ornithology, birds and people, and that was a great introduction in that, we're often rather anthropocentric. We think about everything affecting, the effect that we have on nature, but it's a two-way relationship. Everything is a two-way relationship, and very often conservation biology is framed in a rather anthropocentric way, which is unfortunate. So ecosystem services, for example, um, what how are ecosystems good for us? Well, we should be asking how are we good for ecosystems as well. So it's a two-way process, and I want to frame ethno-ornithology as part of that two-way process, and really that knowing birds and naming birds reflects our relationship with birds in particular, obviously, but nature more broadly. Um, so I'm just going to check. Yeah, we're good. We're good. Okay. So I'm going to start because this lecture, or something very similar to it, I first gave at the Linnean Society in January, in the room where Darwin and Wallace had presented in 1858 their paper on how they thought evolution happened. And so it sort of felt appropriate to start with Darwin, but it turns out that Darwin is quite important for the story I want to tell about ethno-ornithology. Um, it's not letting me click. Okay, I'm going to have to click that to move on. So Darwin said a lot of things about a lot of things, and some of it he got right and some of it he got wrong. But one of the things that he got right, I think, was that he suggested that the formation of different languages, of which we know of 7,000 in the world now, formation of different languages and of distinct species, and the proofs that both have been developed through a gradual process, are curiously parallel. So he saw a sort of parallel between the evolution of languages and the evolution of species. And I'm going to show you some very powerful evidence in support of that. But the process that he described was fundamentally wrong. But there we go. Another important statement, so bringing us more up to date, the United Nations Environment Programme published in 2007 their Global Environment Outlook, and they said biodiversity. So they're talking about biodiversity, and they say biodiversity also incorporates human cultural diversity, which can be affected by the same drivers as biodiversity, and which has impacts on the diversity of genes, other species, and ecosystems. And this has given rise to the idea of biocultural diversity as well as just biodiversity. And I want to put some flesh on those bones. This is obviously a map of the world, but it's showing you, and you can see where Nigeria is. Oh my goodness. What you've got here is a kind of map of global biodiversity represented by the diversity of plants. So the green shading is diversity of plant species in the world, and obviously where you are is a center of diversity as we get into the tropics, into high diversity regions, into Congo basin and the Congo rainforests, obviously high diversity. But the little black dots on here, and there are about 7,000 of them, represent the sort of centers of gravity of languages. And I think you can correct me later if I'm wrong, but I think there are about 400 indigenous languages known from Nigeria, 300 or 400. Um, and out of that, 7,000. And if you just look across this map, you can see the centers of high biodiversity, so the dark green, tend also to be centers of high linguistic diversity. So, in the sort of dark green regions of Central Africa, in the Andes in South America, in Central America, dark green, and then we go to the Himalayas in North India, through into Indonesia, Borneo, and New Guinea, where there are 1,000 languages. It's almost, you can barely see the dark green there on the map of New Guinea because there are so many black dots, almost masking it out. 1,000 languages, very high biodiversity. And so there's a correlation, and we've known this for quite a long time, at least 20 years. And this, in fact, 20 years now, isn't it? This map was published 20 years ago, 2004, in a paper by Stepp et al. And I'm showing you this with his blessing. He actually sent me this lovely copy of the map. And I'm gonna show you a graph shortly that really underpins that. But before I do that, I want to talk about Darwin's perception of evolution. So, we've noted that cultural evolution or linguistic. So languages are the linguistic diversity is the easiest way to sort of characterize human cultural diversity. It's the most obvious thing that you can sort of objectively measure as a difference. And I want to sort of focus this a little bit on the history of his understanding of the people, the culture of the Indians in Tierra del Fuego, right down in the southern tip of South America, where Chile and Argentina meet. And I went there in 2016 onto, this is the Beagle Channel. Can you see my pointer if I do this? Can someone just say yes or no? I've put
Yes.
my, you can, oh brilliant, that's great to know I can use that. So this is the Beagle Channel, first mapped by HMS Beagle in 1832 or whatever it was. And they stuck their name on it. Of course, the local people had their name for it, but it's become known to a global culture as the Beagle Channel. And that ship, of course, Darwin was on. Now there are two people on this map. Charles Darwin, you probably recognise in the top right, and Thomas Bridges, you probably don't recognise, and I'm going to talk about him shortly. But both of them had an engagement with the local people, the local Indians, whose language is now extinct, the local Indians, and they had very different perceptions of those people. So Darwin, he set off from England in 1831, just after Christmas, 1831, and he arrived in what they, is now known as the Beagle Channel. So it was actually discovered the previous year, another expedition by the Beagle, which Darwin wasn't on. They arrived there in 1832. And just to cut a long story short about his ideas about evolution, which you're probably familiar with, I'm sure you're familiar with, he coined the term natural selection to contrast with the artificial selection carried out by humans for thousands of years, which was familiar to everybody. We knew about domestic dogs and cattle and cats and varieties of crops, livestock. and that people had been selecting, for various characteristics for thousands of years. And so he called that artificial selection, and he gave us the idea, the concept of natural selection. Now, at this point, I'm going to say something pretty radical. We cannot overstate the degree to which Charles Darwin's own context in time, in culture, and class, social class, influenced his theory of evolution by natural selection. Darwin was not the first person ever to suggest, ideas about evolution. We know it goes way back to Aristotle in the sort of Western tradition, but actually there are some Old Testament texts in the Bible which predate Aristotle by 1,000 years, talking about sea creatures coming onto land and changing and adapting. So actually, ideas about evolution go way back, are actually biblical. So there we are. That's pretty radical. But we need to understand that his ideas about evolution came out of a particular culture, an imperialistic culture, which saw everything as competition and supremacy. And the errors that came out of that perception, the errors for biologists, are only now being corrected by a new biology. Now, for me to talk about that in detail would take a whole extra lecture, so I'm not going to do that. But what I am going to do is just wave this huge book at you. This is published this year, so it's a new edition of a much smaller book published in 2011 by James Shapiro, called Evolution, A View from the 21st Century. And he's put the subtitle here, Why Evolution Works as Well as It Does. But it's about how evolution really happens, and it's not Darwinian. It's really not Darwinian. It's it's rather more biblical, to be honest. But we won't go into that in any more detail. But that's the book you want to be reading if you want to get up to date with evolutionary theory. So new biology is really reframing all of this. Now, I said I was going to show you a graph that underpinned or really not underpinned, supports that argument that Darwin was right in suggesting that language, the evolution of language, which is obviously a cultural thing, and the evolution of species was a similar process. This graph, which I've plotted and haven't yet published, but which I will publish, shows on the vertical axis the number of established languages per country. So each point on the graph is a different country. I think it's about 160 on there. From the smallest, this is actually the smallest, which is the Vatican City, which is regarded as a state. So it's what the United Nations regard as states. So that's Vatican City. It's up there because it's only half a square kilometre. It's absolutely tiny, but it actually has quite a good bird list and quite a lot of languages. So when you scale this by area, so languages per square kilometre, and this for each country is the number of bird species recorded, scaled per square kilometre, and then it's a log plot, just to kind of straighten it out, because the huge range from very tiny, we're going from tiny areas right up to huge areas, the size of Russia, for example. And what you see is an astonishing correlation. So countries with high biodiversity, numbers of species, also have high linguistic diversity, and Nigeria is in the middle of this somewhere. Now, what Darwin got wrong was that his process that he described was one of what leads to sympatric speciation, where species are supposed to diverge because of competition in the same place. But actually, most species, probably all bird species, originated through what we call allopatric speciation, which reflects local adaptation to local conditions. Now, you can't be in competition. So everyone knows about the Galapagos finches that Darwin didn't really describe in any detail, but that there were supposed to be different species evolved on different islands. And Darwin did spend a lot of time talking about how there were different species in different places. So he describes patterns and he describes a process, but the process that he describes doesn't give rise to the patterns that he describes. So there's a fundamental kind of conflict, a tension within his book. But what this graph is saying is that species adapt locally, organisms adapt locally, whether it's birds or humans, and the expression of local adaptation for humans is the evolution, the origination of local languages. And so that's what we're looking at here. It's local adaptation and relative isolation from other species, other areas, and other languages. And the reason there are 1,000 languages in New Guinea is because it's very mountainous, and the mountains isolate human populations in valleys in different places. And so you have had over thousands of years new languages evolving. The details of the individual languages really give the clue to this, because the words, typically half of the words in local languages are the names of plants and animals, birds, and the way you live with them, and what you do with them, and they really express the relationships between people and the rest of nature, other species in their area. But what we're looking at here is that global expression of that, what you get on a global scale. Well, I want to go into a little bit more detail about the qualities of those languages, and I'm going to use, because Charles Darwin said quite a lot about the people of Tierra del Fuego, of whom he didn't think very much, it has to be said, well, they're frankly racist, so I want to see what he said about the Fuegians, and then we'll look at some other perspectives about them which say something about local languages. So he first encountered the indigenous people in Tierra del Fuego in December 1832, so almost exactly a year after he left England. They made a strong impression on him. He refers to them 7 times in The Origin of Species, and in The Descent of Man in 1871, he cites the Fuegians as evidence that man is descended from a hairy-tailed quadruped and that we are descended from barbarians. So, as I say, he didn't think much of the Fuegians. In The Origin of Species, he says, we see the value set on animals, even by the barbarians of Tierra del Fuego, by their killing and devouring their old women in times of dearth, as of less value than their dogs. So he believed, because he'd actually been told by a Fuegian, Jemmy Button, who'd been taken back to England the previous year and civilized, taught English. Jemmy Button, on the way back to Tierra del Fuego, told Darwin that they ate their old folks. Now, this was actually a myth, put about by the Phrygian people to try and scare foreigners away. They were not cannibals, and I'll show you rather better evidence for that. Um, Darwin, when he was asked about this, he said he believed that because Jemmy Button had told him that. Um, but Jemmy Button probably told him what he wanted to hear. Um, and of the language. So Darwin says of in the Voyage of the Beagle, which is basically his journal, December 17th, 1832, he wrote, "The language of these people, according to our notions, scarcely deserves to be called articulate. Captain Cook has compared it to a man clearing his throat, but certainly no European ever cleared his throat with so many hoarse, guttural and clicking sounds." So he really regarded the Phrygian people as primitive, kind of Stone Age, that they didn't have a proper language. He thought they were cannibals, and he really writes about them in the most disparaging terms. Well, not very long after that, this man, Reverend Thomas Bridges, who was an Anglican missionary, he was actually 18 when he went out to Terra del Fuego with his adoptive father, and he spent the rest of his life there, and a large part of that time documenting, living with the Phrygian people, and documenting their language in great detail. And I want to tell you some things about them. Firstly, because Bridges was not a trained linguist, he developed his own phonetic language to document the sounds of the Yagan language, which is the language of the Yamana people, these people in Tierra del Fuego. And he used that to capture the sounds of the words as well as to try and record the words. Of course, there was no written language. Now, I have a picture of the book there that his children published in the 1930s, so years after Bridges' death. He just left pages and pages and pages of handwritten notes, which were never published in his lifetime. But his children realized that this was of great significance, and so they raised the money to publish it. And I've been fortunate enough to get a copy of his book. It's printed appropriately enough on Bible paper. It's over 600 pages, 665 in fact. It's an amazing thing, and it's now available online as a PDF, which means you can actually analyze it and ask questions of it. And I'm going to show you some of the contents of his book to give you an idea of what he discovered about these amazing people and their wonderful language and culture. So firstly, he says, because Darwin had talked about cannibalism, and maybe you can see down here it says about Darwin. What he says about this, he says cannibalism is utterly impossible amongst these Aborigines by the laws of their society of living, in which human life is considered sacred. The lives of the old men, which according to Darwin were those fixed upon for the purpose of cannibalism, are as sacred to them as of any other person, for they are protected by their relatives. So he understood their culture. They didn't eat each other. They just put about this myth to try and keep foreigners away. And in fact, in the Royal Navy standing orders to people in the Navy in southern South America, they so believed this myth that they actually said, if you are shipwrecked in these areas, you must make your way out of this land as quickly as possible because the natives are cannibals. So they believed the myth, but it wasn't true. Now, because because you can get the book as a PDF, you can ask questions of it. So I spent a happy couple of days getting some details of the language, some words, references to plants and animals, um, just by doing searches on particular uh, word terms, and finding out how many references to the words there are. And I just sort of share a little bit about it. Now, remember that Darwin thought they had no sophisticated language. Thomas Bridges estimated in his book that it contained 23,000 head words. Now, a head word is the basic word from which other variants, um, come. Um, so, for example, if the word civilize, the civilized um, is derived from it. So, civilized would be a head word, and civilized would be another word. Um, but on its publication, his children found, and they wrote about this in the introduction to the book, they found that it actually contained 32,000 distinct head words. And that puts it, if you can look at Wikipedia to get a count of numbers of head words in different languages, and that puts it somewhere between Middle Dutch, so the language of the medieval language of the Netherlands in Europe, and classical Latin at 39,500 words. So this is a very sophisticated language with a complex grammar, hundreds of words having variants depending on, for example, orientation. So if your wigwam was on the beach, which direction you slept made a difference, because you were likely to be warm or cold or whatever, because it's really a long way far south. And so that's the sort of detail that is in there. There are thousands of ethno-ecological references, so references to plants and animals. I found 941 references to canoes, because that's absolutely fundamental to their livelihood. How you make them, what wood you use, what skins you use, really, how you launch them, how you work with them, how you would catch seals with them or penguins, all these things. 317 references to trees, 161 to mussels, 135 to seals. There's 106 references to tree bark, and I was a little bit disappointed with the number of references to penguins. I'd rather wish there'd been more, but I'm going to show you some in a moment. But just a reference to tree bark. So here's a word. I'm not quite sure how to use his phonetics, but if we say it's tatega, it's certain pieces of young small bark, so tree bark, so a particular kind of tree bark, fitted over the rail of a canoe in such parts as where the arms rest in paddling to guard them from chafing. So there's a word for a particular kind of tree bark that makes the rails of your canoe soft, so you don't rub your arm on them. There's that sort of level of detail, which is wonderful. So what have we got here? There's habitat references. So here's talking about to distinguish such countries from others. So different kinds of land. So here's a particular example which have no open dry land and where the evergreen birch prevails, so a particular kind of tree, and the land is largely embedded with mosses. So you've got other kind of habitat references by here. And then the 29 references I found to penguins, including the specific names to all the four local species that are there, which includes king penguins. So here's a word, however it was pronounced. To leap out of the water when going rapidly through the water, as seals and otters do. So what we would call porpoising, um, because that allows you actually to almost fly through the water and then fly out of the water, and that allows you to get up huge speed, um, and to get up. But they also use the same word. I think this is wonderful, to flick shellfish out of the fire. So when they're hot, you flick the shellfish out of the fire, out of the pan, and it reminds them of the penguins leaping out of the water. Um, and because they're hot, you're just flicking them with your finger, or maybe a stick or a fork or something. And then here's another word which refers to the state of lean and sick penguins which come ashore and stand all drawn up together, and the state of a lazy, indolent person. So they're making references between human ways of being, and with reference to other species, penguins in this case. Um, so everything is sort of imbued with this sense of observation, of living with nature. Um, Now, I don't know if you can hear a bird call in the background. Can someone just tell me?
Sure, we can hear
Yeah,
it.
great. Oh, wonderful. That's great. So that is the Beagle channel. I videoed that in 2016, and behind me here is the Yamana Cemetery, because the last, or the Yagang Cemetery, because the last native speaker of this language, Cristina Calderon, passed away in February 2022. It's estimated, we don't know her exact age, but it's estimated that she was 93. And says here, a celebrated ethnographer, craftswoman, writer, and cultural activist. Really tragic. She actually died of COVID. And I met Cristina Calderon in 2016. She was busy making, I want to just show you, she was busy making little rush baskets in a traditional way, and I bought one. This is what she did to make a living, was selling these things to tourists. So basically, I was little better than a tourist. And she made this beautiful little basket, out of local rushes, which had to be sort of heated, and then so that you could work with them and weave them. And I really value and prize this. She was the last speaker of this now extinct language. And I met her sons, so her two sons, who only spoke Spanish. And I don't speak Spanish, but through an interpreter, I asked, so your mother didn't pass the language on to you. And basically, she didn't see a point, because the language was totally embedded in the culture of living in that place. And this was kind of all that was left of that culture, making little baskets for tourists and visitors. And it's kind of tragic that, and if it weren't for Thomas Bridges and his documenting of the language in such exquisite detail, we really wouldn't know the rich culture that they had. So I want to make a strong point to you guys about, I know what are the dominant national languages in Nigeria, but I also know that many of you also speak one or more local languages. And in those local languages are the names of plants and animals. And documenting those things, they express a relationship with the local ecology that is unique and difficult to capture in a national or an international language like English. So you'll have your own ways of thinking about that from your own experience. Now I showed you a graph earlier of indigenous languages by countries and um, and the number of bird species. This is from the same data set, but this is across countries. Of course, there are far fewer of them. What you've got here is all countries that have already had one or more bird extinctions. And this is plotted against the number of immigrant languages. And what you can see here, and actually North America is one of the worst offenders on this, the numbers of bird extinctions by area, as strong a correlation between bird extinctions and immigration or globalization as you had between the indigenous languages diversity and bird diversity. This is basically a bit of a dig to Darwin, but this is basically the smoking gun of imperialism. That with a global culture, we are losing that essential connection with the local, with place that values nature and knows how to live with nature. And the global culture, where young people no longer know the names of plants or animals or anything, is really about that. How do we teach people who do not know what a robin is, or whatever the common local birds are? How do you teach them the importance of conservation? That's a big question. So biocultural diversity and really affirming that, I think, is terribly important for conservation. Just to underwrite that, this paper, I think it's a very important paper, was published in 2019 in the journal Environmental Science and Policy by Schuster et al. And what this says, they're looking at vertebrate biodiversity in indigenous managed lands in Australia, Brazil, and Canada. So 3 relatively biodiverse areas, particularly Brazil and Australia, where there is land still managed in a traditional way by indigenous people, and they're looking at the biodiversity there and in conservation managed areas, and in sort of general areas in those 3 countries. And just to pick out a really key phrase there in the middle of the abstract here, they say, we found that indigenous managed lands were slightly more vertebrate rich than existing protected areas in all 3 countries, and in Brazil and Canada that they supported more threatened vertebrate species than existing protected areas or randomly selected non-protected areas. In other words, that cultural connection with nature that exists in those indigenous managed areas is really crucial for conservation. They were effectively conserving nature in those areas as they had done for hundreds or thousands of years. And conservationists need to learn about what they are doing, but more importantly, it's just about a cultural connection with nature that values nature rather than simply trying to put numbers on everything. Okay, so in 2023, here are 2 newspaper articles from The Guardian, which is a British national newspaper. Actually, it's an international newspaper in that you can see it online, so you can see it anywhere in the world. And I usually know what's going on in The Guardian, although I do read it because I have a friend in uh, where is he? In China, um, who every so often he emails me and says, "Oh, have you seen the latest? This article in the Guardian talking about language extinctions or whatever." So, in January of last year, they published this article on the loss of languages, the extinction of languages, and the importance of that in relation to biodiversity. And in December 29th of the same year, they published this article on the extinction of 21 species in the United States, of which 8 were birds. So 8 bird species were declared extinct last year in the United States alone. So extraordinary. So the extinction of languages and the extinction of biodiversity, the extinction of biocultural diversity, this is really the same thing. It's globalization and losing a sense of the local. Now, this isn't a talk to say, hey, the internet's a terrible thing and globalization has only brought, pain and suffering. Well, it hasn't only brought that. It's brought the means for me to speak to you today from Oxford. So we should celebrate the internet, but we need to temper that celebration with an understanding. As conservationists, we need to have our eyes open and celebrate the local as well as the global. And I think it's having that local and global perspective that is really important. So that kind of brings me on to talking about ethnobiology and ethno-ornithology. So ethnobiology is the study of how people engage with nature, practically, culturally, and spiritually, both now and in the past. Understanding these things is key to effective nature conservation, as I've suggested. And the ways people think about plants and animals are reflected in the names that they give them. And that's why my interest in ethno-ornithology, I mean, as an ornithologist, I'm interested in birds, but as an ethno-ornithologist, one way that I can study those relationships is by looking at the names people give them. So there's a bit of background noise, which is rather delightful. So I want to talk now about what's in a name and the conservation significance of the naming of birds. So 3 things about this. And I hope my nightingale doesn't get so loud that you can't hear me as well. So the first thing is the global loss of biocultural diversity that I've just talked about. And that's our book, Ethno-ornithology, that was published in 2010. And the chapter by Mark Bonter is thinking about ethno-ornithology and conservation in particular. There is something else in the social sciences that is quite important, what's become known as the shifting baseline syndrome, which is the idea or the observation that each generation has experience of less and less nature. And part of the declining connection with nature is because there's less for people to actually connect with. So your generation has had less opportunity to connect with nature than mine did. When I was a child, there were butterflies in our garden in London. Now there aren't. So those sorts of things. And young people today in this country rarely even know the names of a handful of butterflies. And that feeds into this growing disconnection from nature. Which is really described most powerfully in 2006 by this book, Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv. So the bird that you heard singing there was a nightingale. And I want to give you some examples. As I say, I've been working on English names of birds for about 150 species. So that must seem like not very much, if you're working in atlasing birds in Nigeria. And actually, there are 400 species on the British list. But for 150 species, we know the old folk names, the names that ordinary people had for the birds before they were standardized by ornithologists. So before there was a literate culture in the British Isles, people coined the names of birds. They had those connections. So nightingale is quite interesting because it comes straight from Anglo-Saxon, Nachtigall meaning night singer. And there are only two folk names that we know, nightingale and jug, which is a reference to the sound that it makes. But in German, there are many, many more names for the nightingale. So you can see Nachtigall there. In French, there are even more. Loads of names for the nightingale. So every village had its own name for the nightingale in France. And so different parts of the world are different numbers, different traditions of naming. But what you're seeing in the Anglo-Saxon, with there only being two names in English, is that the nightingale had such strong cultural significance, and it was mentioned in Shakespeare, who made a huge, had a huge influence on English and then British culture, and then more widely in the British Empire. That as he knew it as the nightingale, then that kind of stuck. So you have a cultural influence on, maybe before the 16th century, before Shakespeare, maybe there were many names for the nightingale in these islands, who knows, but they weren't recorded. So I want to give you a couple of examples, just a few examples of where we do know something about the names of birds, how they've been recorded, and the sorts of things that they reflect, the sorts of things you might look out for if you are recording local names of birds in different languages. Because there are some basic principles that seem to underpin how people name birds globally. This man, Gilbert White, who you may have heard of, who was an 18th century parson, he lived for most of his life, where he had strong connections with London and Oxford, but he lived most of his life as a parson, an Anglican priest in a little village called Selborne, and he is, as far as science is concerned, he was the first person to recognize that there were these three species of Phylloscopus warbler that we now know as the chiffchaff, the willow warbler, and the wood warbler. And certainly willow warbler and wood warbler winter to some extent in Nigeria. Maybe you know chiffchaffs as well. I'd be interested to know, but it's a shorter distance migrant. Willow warbler definitely gets into Nigeria, and wood warbler goes even further south. But in a letter in 1768, Gilbert White said, "I make no doubt, but there are three species of the willow wrens." So they were known as willow wrens. Two I know perfectly, but have not been able yet to procure the third. So basically, if you couldn't shoot it, you didn't know it existed. No two birds can differ more in their notes. So he recognized that they had different songs. Now this is the chiffchaff song. You should be hearing the song. And these are some of the folk names which indicate that the country people knew this bird. And they knew it as the chiffchaff, which is an onomatopoeic reference to this song. You're hearing say no if you can't hear the song. I'll assume you can hear the song. That's great. Um, but there's some really interesting. So you know, chiff chaff, chiff chaff, chiff chaff, sif saf in Wales, chit chat in Somerset. Um, there are some other names for it. But then there's these interesting, the sweet Billy um, call, imitative of its call note, it says here, from Nottinghamshire, which is an English county. And the sweet Billy call, you see, it seems to be saying sweet, sweet. Can you hear that okay, Joseph? Yeah, great, thank you. And then this is the willow warbler. Totally different song. And it has some of the folk names are in common with the chiffchaff, but most of them are different. The hay triller, for example, is unique to this species. The sweet Billy name is still there, referring to this one as well, and it has a sweet call as well. It's subtly a bit different from the chiffchaff, but it's still saying sweet. It's slightly more sweet than sweet. And then the third species, which Gilbert White thought existed because he knew it had a different song. This is the wood warbler, and the toot 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 is the call. And I'm playing both of those simultaneously. And you notice there is a name, the tuit, which is maybe a reference to that call. So what I'm saying here is that the country folk knew that there were three species of birds. Maybe Gilbert White's parishioners actually told him that, I don't know. But when he wrote it down in a letter and sent it to a fellow of the Royal Society, then he was given the credit for having discovered these birds. But they were known to the country folk already. Here's another one. Gilbert White says the grasshopper lark, or grasshopper warbler, we know it now. The grasshopper lark began his sibilous note in my fields last Saturday. Had I not been a little acquainted with insects and known that the grasshopper kind is not yet hatched, I should have hardly believed but that it had been a locusta, in other words, a grasshopper. The country people laugh when you tell them that it is the note of a bird. And I think the country people were laughing because they knew that. He assumed they didn't know that, but they did know it, because if you look at the folk names, there's even, I think, here a folk name from Hampshire. The folk names clearly show that they knew it was a bird. So again, this kind of dismissing the local, not understanding the local culture, assuming that the people were ignorant, but actually they knew all about this stuff. Now I want to give you, finish up this little section of my talk with a really, really powerful example of just how much the local people knew. In this country, we have three species of these acrocephalous warblers, and maybe one or two of them winter in Nigeria. I'm not sure. Maybe reed warbler, maybe sedge warbler. I'm not sure. You can tell me afterwards. But we have the reed warbler, the marsh warbler, which is very rare now, and the sedge warbler. And I'm going to play you their songs. So this is the reed warbler. And it has some mimicry in it. And I'll stop that. And this is the sedge warbler, which has a bit more mimicry in it. that's a bit of yellow wagtail. You might recognise yellow wagtail there. Somewhere in this recording I pick up a little bit of swallow, I think, as well. I think yeah, that sounds like swallow, doesn't it? Or house martin, That's perfect, house martin. So this sedge warbler is mimicking a little bit. But this bird, this is the marsh warbler. That's the sweet billy note. The reason that song is so different from the others is because it is entirely mimicry. Nobody really knows what a marsh warbler song would sound like. It consists entirely of mimicry. One marsh warbler in Belgium was recorded singing the songs of 153 different species, and before we knew where they wintered in East Africa, it was estimated from the songs of African species that it was singing in Belgium when it came back in the summer. And now I believe that the purpose of that mimicry is actually to say where you spent the winter, and to for females to pair up with individuals. It's basically saying, he's singing a postcode. He's singing, look, I spent the winter in a place that sounds like this, and I was born in a place that sounds like this. This is the sound environment that I've experienced in my whole life. And if you recognize this, well, why don't we, dance and, make babies? Because basically our babies need to carry genes that are going to take them to a place where they will survive. And we are living proof that experience worked. And so sexual selection is a kind of part of the story, but it's not about the quality of the song. It's about the information content of the song. That's my argument. But that's a slight shift away from the folk names. Now, the country folk didn't recognize that there were 3 different species there because, they look very, very similar, as you saw, but they did recognize that they were mimicking. Now, something about the marsh warbler is that it sings at night as well as in the daytime. Sedge warbler and reed warbler only sing in the daytime. Now, if we look at these English folk names, fisherman's nightingale, so it's a reference to singing at night. But then there's these references to mockingbird, a mock bird. Now the mockingbird, North American species, or the English mockingbird here, the mockingbirds are called mockingbirds because they mimic other birds' song. So whoever coined that name, the English mockingbird, recognized that this bird was singing the songs of other species. And for him to, and I say him because it probably was someone sitting there at night fishing, and that's more likely a man, because of the culture at the time. He's sitting there thinking, oh, he's doing a swallow now, and now it's a blue tit, right? So whoever coined that name, English mockingbird, knew the songs of the other birds and recognized that it was mimicking. So we don't know the name of that person. Of course, it's lost in the mists of time, but we can tell that they knew their bird songs. Well, how we know all those names is thanks to this amazing gentleman, Michel Defay, who I met in 2014. Now, on his lap there is volume 1 of his great thesaurus. This is volume 1. I had to buy it. It's 2 enormous books documenting 100,000 English folk. Not English. 100,000 European folk names of birds in 11 European languages. 100,000 folk names, and that's where I got the 7,000 English or folk names in English from the British Isles. Um, and I went to visit him in 2014, um, just coming up to Christmas. I just noticed I've got the same little book there that I had there in. That's how long I've had that. 2014, 10 years ago, um, to talk about getting his thesaurus on the internet, and we now have that. I want to talk a little bit about some of the sort of principles of naming, and that come out of looking at those folk names. So he lists 7,000 folk names out of his 100,000 for 150 British bird species, of which about half are passerine birds. And most quarry species, what we mean by that, most species that were hunted were non-passerines. So when people say, oh, they only named the birds that they shot or hunted or whatever, it's just not true. It's really not true. And where these names come from, or many of them, during the 19th century, biologists were actually very interested in what the local names of birds were. And so this magazine called The Zoologist invited people to submit their local bird names. And they published them. And Michel Defay extracted those names from these published accounts. Now it's really interesting. I'm showing you one example of a letter to the editor in 1878 by someone called G.G. Little, and he makes the point. He said, by the way, has it struck any philologist? So that's somebody who studies language, a linguist or etymologist. Any philologist that names of animals, particularly of birds whose names are under the protection of the rising and bird nesting generations, so basically the children, are more likely to be handed down correctly than perhaps any other words. Is not this worth the attention of the Anthropological Society? And yeah, it really is. And well, 100 years later, no, more than 100 years later, at last someone's doing it. So, better late than never. Just a few quick examples of names of birds that express people's knowledge of bird nesting. So here's some names for long-tailed tit, which is a European species, British bird. It has something like 70 folk names recorded, and many of those names, most of those names, in fact, there are references to the nest, which is a sort of moss ball, hollow ball held together with, well, it's moss and feathers and lichen, and it's held together with cobwebs. It's a spider's web. It's a most amazing structure. And the children knew the long-tailed tit. Some cuckoo references in the names of meadow pipit, tree pipit, and dunnock. The meadow and tree pipits are common hosts for cuckoos, and there are no cuckoo references in the names of any other passerines. And I think this name foolish sparrow for the dunnock is probably a cuckoo reference, because dunnocks don't even attempt to, or rather dunnock cuckoos don't attempt to match their eggs to dunnocks, because dunnocks will sit on anything. They're not discriminating at all. And then some names here for some buntings to refer to scribbling, scribblefinch, and the schoolmaster, scribbling schoolmaster. It's rather wonderful. These are children who are learning to write, and they're seeing these eggs that remind them it really does look like someone's been scribbling on the eggs. Um, and then another thing, that the names are phonetic and contextual. What that means is they refer to the bird as you experience it. It's not trying to say something about evolutionary relationships. It's not creating a taxonomic hierarchy. It's just how you experience it, and will recognize it. So what is the context, um, and how do you experience it? And that may create a sort of what looks like a taxonomic or a systematic structure. So, for example, this dipper name for the war. So the dipper is a bird that it's a passerine bird that lives in fast-flowing streams, can actually swim underwater, but it looks a bit like a blackbird. And ouzel is an old name for the blackbird, and so water ouzel is basically saying, well, it looks like, it reminds me of an ouzel, but it lives in the water, and that looks like it has a systematic structure, like ouzels are a genus and water ouzel is a particular species of ouzel. Um, Now we can define those species to which people refer you to recognize it as iconic. That's to say, they're not arbitrary, but they're reminiscent of something else. It gives the appearance of a hierarchical taxonomic structure, but it's actually not quite that. But we find that same structure of names right across the world in local names in indigenous languages. Those iconic species, the ones to which people refer you to, so the ouzel in the name water ouzel, those iconic species tend to have more folk names. They're more likely to be named locally, and that's why we know there are more names, because we're looking at locally coined names of birds. So, for example, the wren in this country has 164 folk names, and we met the willow wren, as a referent in the willow warbler name earlier. Well, something else in the sort of English language tradition is a tendency to give Christian names to birds that you're very familiar with. So most people here know of Jenny Wren, but actually the wren has lots of names like this. Kitty Wren. Here's another one for the pied wagtail. So Bessie, Joanna, Molly, names where the bird is being given a Christian name. Here's some names similarly for the Dunnock, Hedge Betty. So Betty and Jenny and Molly and again Billy here. And I think we've got some here again for the longtail, Kitty Longtail, Maggie Muffy, Jackie Bo Peep, whatever. And what we think is happening here is that people are coining these names to teach their children the names of familiar birds. So, this is Bobby Robin, this is Jenny Wren. And in a culture, so 19th century culture, that where you would only refer to somebody by their first name, their Christian name, if they were either a very close friend or a child, this formation of a name is saying something about relationship, that you should regard these birds as your friends and as children, and if they are children, then they're dependent on you, and you have a responsibility for them, as you have a responsibility for your children. And the children would have grown up with these names and the sense of responsibility for the birds around them. And I've done a little analysis here, which is still to be published, showing the tendency across species this is just for passerine birds, to have a number of names of that sort of Christian name form, or familiar or friendly, affectionate name form, is also goes with a tendency to have single word names. So birds that are very familiar, you don't call it a something swallow, you just call it a swallow if there's only one of them. Um, and the wren. Now, you can't be monolexic, have a single word name, and also have a name of the form Jenny Wren. So it's interesting that species that have more names of a monolexic form are also more likely to have more names, obviously different names, of the familiar form. And you can see that these open circles, um, these are the iconic species. The non-iconic species are much less likely to have either of those kinds of names. But the iconic species are the familiar, and it's because they're iconic, you know that they will be familiar to people. Um, and it's interesting historically to look at some of the species on that list of iconic species are now quite rare, but they must have been very common in the 19th century and earlier. Now I'm kind of a bit aware of time moving on, so I think I'm going to skip on a bit, um, and um, just talk. Well, I'll just focus on the Sally Wren here, because we talked about the willow warbler. Some of these names are very, very clever. So Sally Wren. Wren was used to mean any small bird, like the wren. So any small bird. So Sally is both a girl's name, so implying that it's a friend. It's familiar. It's a girl's name, but it's also a reference to willow. So it's a Sally, or sallow was an old name for willow. So it's a reference to habitat. But sallying, to sally, and you might see in the field guides references to sallying. What flycatchers do is flying out and back to a perch, which willow warblers do. And you'll see that in winter in Nigeria as well as here. So this name Sally Wren captures the sense of your relationship with it, of its habitat, and of its behavior. And I think that's really, really clever. That sadly we've lost that as a name for the willow warbler. So the variation, the reason that some species only have one or two names and some have over 100 names, reflects what we call their ecological salience. So how common a species was and how likely you are to encounter it. And I've just got, I think, one graph to express this. This is published in a paper of mine in 2017, ecological salience. What we're doing here is I'm looking at the number of 19th century counties in the British Isles where we know the bird was present, and the number of folk names. And in those counties where you can see that where there are more, where a species with more a wider distribution also were more likely to have more folk names. And there are some interesting individual cases in there, like the green woodpecker here. So this isn't just passerine birds. We've got some non-passerines in here as well. But broadly speaking, more widely distributed species had were more likely to be to have their own names locally, and there is some relationship here with their likelihood to have folklore, but that's kind of another story. So I want to kind of end up now, coming gently into land, shallow descent coming into land, um, to just say something about the conservation significance, importance of bird naming. Um, so what we've seen is that in the English culture, the bird folk names reflect a rich culture engaged with birds, showing intimate knowledge of birds' behavior, their ecology, and their relative abundance. And that provides a new form of baseline by which to assess the lost awareness of nature in contemporary British culture. And you can think about this in terms of the various cultures local to where you are. So thinking back to what we said earlier about the three key issues for conservation concern of the global loss of biocultural diversity, shifting baseline syndrome, but also this growing human disconnection from nature. The last thing I want to show you is about some work that I've done here in Oxford, referring to this last child in the woods, just to measure the loss of knowledge of nature. And this is actually amongst our own biology students here. So we run a field course every year for biology students. These are first year biologists. That photographs just a few years ago with my friend and colleague George. We're opening a mist net there and showing them some bird ringing. But I did a study of their own natural history knowledge before they went out on this field course. So this is towards the end of their first year as undergraduates. And I was sort of motivated by the numerous accounts of declining natural history knowledge over generations. And I wanted to see how much these students knew. So they're all chosen to read biology at Oxford. So you might think they'd know all their local common birds or whatever. And many millennials, so you know what they're calling people born around the turn of the century, there are many accounts growing up of millennials knowing barely a handful of common plant or animal species, but there were very few quantitative studies documenting that decline in post-industrial societies. So it says we because the publication was with a colleague from the Field Studies Council, but actually all the field work was, I did all the field work. So I recorded their natural history knowledge of 149 UK resident first year biology students. So they were all born and or grew up in the UK. It turned out that several overseas students actually knew more than our local students, but you need a kind of level playing field. And before they went on this field course, they were given a one-page questionnaire. So they were asked to give the names of 5 British birds, 5 British trees, 5 butterflies, 5 mammals, and 5 flowering plants. So just 5 off the top of their head, and to say whether they thought it was native or introduced or they didn't know. And on the back of the sheet, it asked them some things about themselves. So it was anonymous, never discovered who they were as individuals, but we knew their age and sex and, you know, where they were born and, you know, did they live in the town or the country? And then who did they learn their natural history knowledge from? You know, parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters, friends. Were they self-taught? Did they learn from teachers in a formal taught capacity or not? Nannies through a church or equivalent community or something other. They actually have data for more than 200 students, but this is just analysing the the British students. Um, so, what did we discover? In 2013-14, whilst most of them, 95% of students could give 5 bird names, only a bit over half of them could actually give 5 names to species level. So they'd say things like duck or seagull or crow or eagle, but actually they were asked to give names to species level. And only 12.8% could correctly name 5 British butterflies, and half of them couldn't name a single British butterfly, which is pretty incredible. You know, for my generation, I knew a dozen butterflies by the age of 5. And so this is really, for me, quite extraordinary. So this is all published. In the journal People and Nature. I'll come on to that in a second. But what this is showing is their total natural history score. So if I can just go back to this, each name got a score of 1 to 3, depending on whether it was in the correct category. You know, is it actually a bird? Is it a British bird? And have you done it to species level? So you get 3 if you correctly named a bird to species level. And if you correctly said whether it's native or introduced, you could get an extra mark. So it was out of 4, and there are 25 names there, so it's out of 100. And so the scores here, their total score is out of 100. And what we have here on this axis is their scores for just mammals, flowers, butterflies, birds, trees, butterflies, mammals, and flowers there. And that's the number of taxa they got right, but this is their actual score. And what you see, so the shading of the points, so each point is a different student, and what you see is that the black dots are students who said both parents and grandparents were sources of information for their knowledge of natural history. The grey dots were parents or grandparents, and the white dots were those who had no family influence on their natural history knowledge. And you can clearly see that this is family knowledge. Teachers actually are not influencing this very much. They learnt their natural history in the family. This is ethno-biological knowledge. So that's just saying the same thing. And the last graph on this, and pretty much the last slide in my talk, is that I was able to actually give a measure of the value of the names that they gave. So it's okay to say, okay, well, you gave 5 names, but were they really common birds, or did you say something a bit exceptional? And you could give a value to a name on the basis of salience. So the salience of a bird is, if everybody in the community knows that bird, then that has very high salience but low value. So if everyone knows a robin, then robins are really salient, but that's low value. But if only one person knows the great northern diver, then that has very low salience, but very high value. And so what I've given here, I've actually gone through and given a value score by looking at how many students named a species. So I think 70 of them named the robin, so high salience, low value, but only one named great northern diver. And that's the average mean bird value for a student, and their total natural history score minus the bird score. So this is the names of birds that they gave, and this is the total score. And you can see that students who named, who knew a lot and gave the names of birds that few other people named, also had very high natural history knowledge generally. And in fact, one of these students here, who actually got 100% on their questionnaire, had named great northern diver, little egret, lesser spotted woodpecker, glossy ibis, and something else, willow tit or something. And under whether it was native or introduced, had written a little essay in the margin. They only had 10 minutes for this. Wrote a little essay in the margin saying it's arrived in the UK, little egrets arrived in the UK in the last 30 years because of climate change. Now, what's fascinating about that is that this was a completely anonymous survey. So I don't know who those students were, and they could have gone for the low-hanging fruit. They could have gone for the easy answers, but they chose not to. That student chose to really demonstrate their knowledge, despite the fact that it can't contribute to their degree. I don't know who they are. We can't give them any brownie points for it at all, except to say there was someone at Oxford 10 years ago who knew a great northern diver. Well, we published the results of all that in a paper in 2021, so 3 years ago, almost to the year, 2021, in the journal People and Nature. This guy, Noah Hearn, who gave me permission to use this photograph, his little face really says everything. It was that he was quite a keen bird watcher, and that's the first time he had a robin in his hand. And I think you may have experienced bird ringing, and you know, just his face says to me the difference that it makes to people in actually having that close connection with nature. And so bird ringing is really important. Now, our Ethno-ornithology World Atlas Group, and these are some of our students and my colleagues working on this, we're trying to document names around the world. And you can log on to the EWATLAS site, the EWA site, and document, local Nigerian bird names if you'd like to, on that site, and tell us whatever you know about them. And it's really inspired. So there's the URL. You can connect with that. And it's really inspired by Michel Defay's amazing work. And I showed you the book. And sadly, Michel passed away at the age of, 94? Just before Christmas, 2023. So another extinction of an incredibly rare individual. And I'd like to just dedicate this to him and the work that he's inspired, and I hope this has inspired you a bit to do some of the same. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was so inspiring, and just knowledge filled, that you have to try to hold on and to listen and to try to grab in everything. So thank you so much for your time and for this inspiring talk. Before I say anything, I would open the floor to anyone still on the call. If you have a question, please, you can just kindly unmute and directly ask Andy, or you can just drop it in the chat. I can read it out to him. Thank you so much.
Would you like me to stop sharing and then we can see everyone on the screen?
Yes, please stop sharing, and then I can actually just stop recording as well. Thank you so much. Yeah.